Art is interpretive. There are a million billion ways to look at one piece of media. I can watch a movie and take away the relationships between characters, maybe gleaning a metaphor for love or openness, and you can watch that same film and take away the meaning of the relationships between a father and a son. I can play a game and take it literally, viewing it as a story written with characters in mind and rules to its universe, and you can play the same game, looking at every character as an insert for the stages of grief. I can watch a TV show and look at its vast ocean of layers, intricacies, visual complexity, and take away the merit of its technical capabilities while also respecting the variety of metaphors hidden underneath, and you can tell me that it's about electricity and the rise of television. The point I'm trying to make here is that art is interpretive. It's kind of the whole point. We exist as beings to sit around and contemplate what a piece, a work, a text is saying to us, or about us, or for us. Our world, experiences, lives, gender, skin color, taste, mood, demeanor will all affect and color that interpretation. But good art has many interpretations. It can be looked at many ways. The best pieces of media will leave me and you arguing for hours about its complex themes and intricate structure. Alan Wake happens to fall into this category, a piece of media that is both interesting, fun, frustrating, beautiful, flawed, and layered. It's a wonderful thing, because I don't think the game is perfect in any way. Certain elements are dated, which is not something I ever really say about a video game, but the experience could certainly use a touch-up. But the simple concept behind that same combat is incredibly interesting. Its story is rich, a tapestry weaved with metaphors about the process of writing itself, imposter syndrome, fear, insecurity, pressure, real human emotion weaved into the narrative. But at the same time, the game has so much to say about the nature of creation itself, the relationship between the audience and the artist, the through line between the game's creator, and the player themselves. And in the same breath, the game manages to be incredibly fun, quirky, kitschy, and light. We feel like we're watching an episode of The Twilight Zone, something terrifying but comfortable. I wouldn't call Alan Wake a horror game, but it flirts with the idea of horror. The horror that is present in Alan Wake is more intense, though, at least the physical horror that the player experiences. For the characters, the horror is both physical, psychological, almost eldritch and cosmic. The game also wears its inspirations on its sleeve. Alan Wake calls itself Stephen King, but Alan Wake is not just Stephen King. Alan Wake is Twin Peaks. Alan Wake is Silent Hill. Alan Wake is House of Leaves. Alan Wake is The Twilight Zone. Alan Wake is Hitchcock. Alan Wake is what came before it, but it is also inextricably, unabashedly itself. And as much as I want an update to the experience, the game has stood the test of time and has not dared to back down when fighting against that stream. Alan Wake is a wonderful experience, with many layers of analysis to be had, a wet dream for someone who makes videos like I do. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into Alan Wake. We'll be talking about story, gameplay, mechanics, and everything in between. In this case, the everything in between refers to quite a lot of supplementary material, DLCs, and something that isn't quite DLC or full game. I'd like to try and make something today that could possibly come close to explaining the appeal of this game. That's not a very easy task, and we may veer off in some places, but try to stay with me. I just want to point out that there is a lot here. I spent tons of time researching history and lore, consuming media within the universe and surrounding it, and of course, playing Alan Wake. Alan Wake is so unique and so interesting. It's just one of those worlds that you can get easily caught up in. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Alan Wake. Alan Wake was developed by Remedy Entertainment. It was directed by Marcus Maki and written by Sam Lake, Mikko Rautalahti, and Petri Järveletto. Also, please forgive my terrible pronunciation of these Finnish names. Back in October of 2003, Remedy had just shipped their absolute masterpiece, Max Payne 2: The Fall of Max Payne. The team had taken some time away from the crunch of that development, and once they were back in the studio, they got to work on a new slate of ideas. After going through multiple concepts, they landed on something interesting: the concept for Alan Wake. The early ideas for the game were to make a game with a deeper narrative than the Max Payne series. Lake and his team were influenced by things like Stephen King novels and the show Twin Peaks. The original idea included an episodic format for the game, almost as if it was a television show. Alan was supposed to be the main character, a writer who finds himself in a supernatural town where his words have come to life to attack him. The team wanted to get as far away from Max Payne as they could, not because they hated the series, but because as creatives, they wanted change. This meant moving away from Payne's story structure as well. Instead of making a linear narrative, Remedy decided to make an open world game, allowing the player to explore a free and open environment. They had even developed tools to aid them in this task. The team had to create a new engine from the ground up and created a system that would develop land and terrain quickly, designating areas that were saved for roads or paths. One of the original ideas was also to have a day and night cycle. This mechanic would connect with the game's themes as well, aligning conceptually. The original idea was closer to something we'd see in a modern survival horror game. During the daytime hours, you would leave cover and head out into the wild, collecting resources to be able to power generators or protect yourself at night. Lake found this idea difficult, though, when developing a story. It was hard to craft a narrative around this gameplay loop. One of the early ideas was that the town the game takes place in, Bright Falls, would have had an active volcano that was about to erupt, leaving the town empty and evacuated. So far, development wasn't going great, and the team was having tons of trouble, running into many issues with tech and story alike. They had yet to secure publishing, so they showed the game off at E3 2005 to try and get the attention of some prospective publishers out there. Microsoft Game Studios stepped in as a publisher and saw that Remedy was struggling greatly. They tried to help the team, but they were drifting further and further off course, and they were missing deadlines, running out of time. The whole team's morale was low. They felt upset with the work that they had been doing. They also felt a massive amount of pressure because this was their first venture outside of the first success the team had ever seen in that of Max Payne. They had to refocus management and create a team specifically to go through each aspect of design and cut what wasn't working. This is where the combat was drastically overhauled. The game became what we see today, fighting enemies with the light and dark aspects, safe havens, and most importantly, the decision was made to make the game a linear narrative. This fixed a lot of issues for the team, especially with being able to create a cohesive story. The team had already done so much work on the map for Alan Wake, so they decided to take the open world and chop it up to create linear levels. This may have been an incredibly unorthodox approach to designing a world, but it worked out very well. It created a sense of cohesion in the world, and looking off in the distance, seeing other areas and landmarks, makes the places we inhabit feel real. Alan Wake was meant to be an everyman, almost the exact opposite of Max Payne. He was a writer, not an action hero. This was supposed to be reflected in the gameplay, that Alan couldn't fight like Max could. The enemies in the game were meant to be different as well, and strange. The team took the concept art for these monsters and poured water over them to make them look a bit off. Once the large shift in development happened, things started to go much more smooth. In August of 2009, 6 years after the release of Max Payne 2, the game was announced as finished and undergoing final polish. Alan Wake was released on Xbox 360 on May 14th, 2010, and on Microsoft Windows on February 16th, 2012. A few notes before we get into things. There are only 2 versions of Alan Wake. The original version that was released in 2010 and 2012, and the remastered version that was released in 2021. This remastered version upgrades the visuals and wraps the DLC content into one package. But honestly, as far as changes go, that's about it. The game functions very similarly to the original version. The biggest change is probably Alan Wake's model. It's made to look closer to the actor that his look is based off of, Ilka Ville. But the environmental upgrade is barely noticeable unless the footage is viewed side by side. I played back through the PC version after I had already finished my remastered playthrough and had to double check if I somehow got an upgrade to the remaster. There were also some QR codes in the original Alan Wake. These were mostly jokes that led to certain sites that had funny GIFs and such. Here they lead to YouTube videos, unlisted on Remedy's channel, that are visions of Alan Wake from the 2019 game Control. Don't worry, we'll get there. Overall, I think that the lack of changes to Alan Wake is actually a good thing. We'll talk a bit more about this opinion throughout the video, but the fact that Remedy has stood by this game rather than let it fall to the flood of remake culture speaks to its validity and the purpose of some of the game's elements. Also, in my opinion, if you decide to pick up Alan Wake because of this video, just buy the PC version. It's incredibly cheap on Steam, and the very slight graphical upgrade probably isn't worth your extra money. I also want to point out that I did do multiple playthroughs of Alan Wake. The first was on a normal playthrough to get the main story and introductory experience that one would have when playing the game. I also played through the DLC on this run. I played through about half of the game again on easy to grab a few trophies, and then finally played the game through a second time fully on nightmare difficulty. This is because Alan Wake has some very important collectibles that are hidden behind nightmare difficulty. These collectibles don't just influence trophies or rewards, they are actually important to the story overall. I then also went back and played the game again on PC. Alan Wake begins with a narration.
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic, and there's little fun to be had in explanations. They're antithetical to the poetry of fear. In a horror story, the victim keeps asking why, but there can be no explanation, and there shouldn't be one.
This short voice clip is incredibly important. Of course, it does something incredibly simple. It establishes Alan Wake, our main character, as a writer.
The unanswered mystery is what stays with us the longest, and it's what we'll remember in the end. My name is Alan Wake. I'm a writer.
This statement, I am a writer, is almost redundant. We can basically infer that Wake is a writer from the previous statement. There's almost a sarcastic humor in it right from the beginning. But why this focus on explanations? This quote from Stephen King, explanations are antithetical to the poetry of fear, and there's little fun to be had in them. Also, Wake stating himself that there can be no explanation in a horror story. It takes the fun out of it. This is true, and if Alan Wake considers itself a horror story, then it follows this rule well. It will not hold our hand, it will not explain things to us. There will be no definitive answers at the end of this story. Alan states this right from the beginning, but even more importantly, Sam Lake, Remedy, states this from the very beginning. Here's where we stand, now we can play the game. Wake continues to narrate as he brings us into his dream. Now, this opening on a writer's nightmare is perhaps the first trope, or evidence of the presence of an archetype that we'll find in the game. We, as the public, have this idea about writers, that they're somehow bigger than us, just creatives in general. They tend to take a pedestal in the public eye. They are mythological creatures, massive and built up. Their dreams seem to take on a supernatural quality to them. During their sleep, they seem to access some ethereal, otherworldly font of knowledge that us mere mortals are not blessed with visiting. Stephenie Meyer famously revealed that the idea for the Twilight books came to her in a dream. Anne Rice seemed to have some sort of prophetic prescience in her dream before she wrote Interview with the Vampire. Even Stephen King himself said that there was some connection between dreams and the creative process. Alan Wake takes this idea and runs with it. Its opening chapter takes place in one of our titular main character's nightmares. He's entering a fictional town called Night Springs, late for something, when he hits someone with his car. As Wake's own novels are spilled out over the concrete, the game begins to speak at us, telling us how to play it, and we begin actually controlling our character. The body of the man that Wake hit is gone, and he seeks the solace of the lighthouse off in the distance. We're quickly set upon by some sort of shadow monster that taunts us with Wake's insecurities. He lambasts Wake for feeling as if he's God, creating something.
There would be a single readable sentence in your books if it wasn't for your editor. You'll never publish another one of those shitty stories, because I'm gonna kill you.
As someone who wouldn't necessarily call themselves a writer, but someone who has written for hundreds of hours and takes those writings and produces them into content for a living, and also is currently writing this sentence in a Google document entitled Alan Wake Retrospective, I've seen these shadows before. I haven't seen these shadows before because I played Alan Wake back in 2012. I haven't seen these shadows before because Alan Wake intrigued me, and it was one of the first games that I begged my mom to buy me on my Dell Inspiron laptop when I was 15 years old. I've seen these shadows before because there's one currently standing behind me saying pretty similar things. The shadow cuts deep, somewhere below the abdomen, but not quite at the waist. Some days you wake up with a flashlight, and other days you don't. This is one of the focal points of Alan Wake, not only as a character, but as a game. I wouldn't say it is the focal point, but that's why we're talking about it 5 pages in and not 20. Alan is insecure, specifically about his writing. I made a video in November of 2021, almost a year and a half ago. It was about the Max Payne series. I wrote that video in the shadow of my most successful video at the time, and still my most successful video to this day. It was my first success, and following it up was incredibly terrifying. The pressure mounted, and the Max Payne series and that video were for me about that feeling, that crushing weight. Remedy perfectly encapsulates that feeling inside of the character of Alan Wake. Sam Lake stated in his Ars Technica interview that Alan Wake wasn't a reflection of his own fears about writer's block, but was a manifestation of his entire team, working for years on a project that was not working out, not surfacing, not going through. We'll see this idea returned to again and again, as it's a through point for the world of Alan Wake, but its feelings and emotions are truly honest and raw. They also happen to be something that speak to me in an incredibly close way. Wake makes his way toward the lighthouse, again, learning combat when the game begins to speak directly to us and tell us how to do it. Wake then meets someone named Clay Stewart, an incredibly important figure that we'll come back to in what will probably feel like years. He helps Alan get inside the cabin and is then killed by one of the strange shadows outside. Alan is attacked by some massive force while inside the cabin and damaged. We're greeted by a white light, who tells us to heal ourselves underneath the street lamp. He tells us something incredibly important, something that we won't understand for quite some time.
For he did not know that beyond the lake he called home lies a deeper, darker ocean green, where waves are both wilder and more serene. To its ports I've been. To its ports I've been. Do you understand?
No.
And then he teaches us how to fight. The crux of Alan Wake's combat system, which we'll get into more in depth in a moment, is all about light and darkness. We talked about this in the development section of the video, and this was a core theme throughout the entirety of the game's rocky development. The theme persists in the final narrative that saw release. Before we can damage enemies and defeat them, we have to shine a light on them, knocking away a sort of shield that they have. Then we can shoot them with a weapon and damage them. We're given some flares, and eventually Wake runs as fast as he can from a raging tornado of darkness and barely makes it into the safety of the lighthouse. But as soon as he does, he's told to wake up, sleeping in his car. Alan and his wife are on a barge heading across the water into the town of Bright Falls. Alan hasn't had the greatest last few months. As we'll learn, Alan hasn't been able to follow up his recent success with a new title, and this has caused a great strain in his relationship. The strain isn't just in his relationship with his wife Alice, but also himself. We'll also learn that Alan has been lashing out and had some problems in the media. This is kind of a big trip for the couple because it's finally their chance to get away from it all, to relax, to be away from the stresses, and maybe Alan can find a way to break down that dam that's preventing his creative juices from flowing. On the barge, we meet one of the other two people on the ship, Pat Maine, who is a local radio host. He asks Alan for an interview, but he adamantly denies it in actually kind of a rude way.
Look, Mr. Maine, I'm on vacation. In fact, I'd appreciate it if we could keep my being here just between the two of us. I'm sure you understand.
There's one other person on the barge, someone we don't talk to, but that's not important because Barry, Alan's manager, calls him. He's hounding his client to make sure he isn't having any problems in the small town. Alan heads into the local diner to meet a man named Stucky, who is supposed to give him the key to the cabin he and his wife will be staying in. Inside the diner, he meets a woman named Rose, who is a massive fan of Wake's novels. He also meets a local park ranger named Rusty, two older brothers named Tor and Odin Anderson, and a strange woman named Cynthia Weaver, who folks around town call the Lamp Lady. This beginning section is really our brief but detailed introduction to the town of Bright Falls. We'll have a few more sequences that aren't action involved where we actually get to simmer in the environment, the sights, sounds, and dialogue that make up this special place in the world. But this is the first big one. The town already feels pretty familiar though, doesn't it? That's because it is. Now, of course, this is the every town America trope, the small town that most people who have never experienced it dream of living in. A quiet community with old-era problems, simple issues, and simple lives. Every person seems to fill their role in this system. It's a fine balance, and it works, like an efficient machine, seemingly giving everyone the best lives they could ever want. The classic foil to this is disrupting this balance, introducing some element to shake things up and change this for the better. But this isn't just the archetypical representation of a small town in America. Bright Falls is also heavily inspired by the town of Twin Peaks. If you aren't familiar, Twin Peaks is a television show created by David Lynch and Mark Frost. It was a show that established this same sort of idyllic small town, a simple place with simple people. Except that was just the surface, because underneath, everything was much more complex than you could ever imagine. Twin Peaks presented itself as a murder mystery set in a backwater American town, but it wasn't just a murder mystery, because after a bit of watching, the metaphysical, esoteric, and all-around strange begins to creep in. This is what, in my opinion, makes the show truly great. That there are many moments across its relatively short runtime where we have almost no idea what's going on at first glance. Some of the appeal in watching the show is trying to solve the mystery, but the Stephen King quote from the beginning of Alan Wake describes the situation aptly. Explanations are antithetical to the poetry of fear, and there's little fun to be had in them. In my opinion, this quote shouldn't just stretch itself to horror, it should grow its ambition a little. Twin Peaks may not be horror, though you could certainly make the case that it is. Consider the first episode, for example, that has almost a half an hour of people just screaming with grief, sadness, and agony. It's an existential hell to watch. Regardless, some of the fun of Lynch's work is realizing that there may not be a concrete explanation to exactly what is happening on the screen before you, and that's okay. This isn't to say don't interpret, this is to say that this media could possibly act as a litmus test for your own personality. The way you view it could be some sort of reading, reflective of your own inner self. But how does this fit into Alan Wake? Alan Wake styles itself as Stephen King. Again, the game quotes him at the very beginning, and in most interviews you find with the developers, Lake & Co. will normally first list Stephen King as an inspirational reference before anything else. And is Stephen King here? Sure, but I think that Stephen King is here in much more of a bird's eye view, a general top-down approach. To use an obligatory food metaphor, if Stephen King is the chocolate ganache on top of the cheesecake, then Lynch is the sugar baked into it. The game, not only in concept, is littered with references to Twin Peaks. The aforementioned diner is very similar to the Double R diner from that show. Rose herself, the waitress that works there, is also similar to Shelley Johnson, who works at the Double R. The lamp lady, Cynthia Weaver, is clearly a reference to the log lady from Twin Peaks. An FBI agent named Nightingale will show up later, who is the direct opposite of the FBI agent from Twin Peaks, Dale Cooper. We hear about his character in a manuscript page that we find later. Nightingale doesn't want to be in Bright Falls. Cooper is happy to be in Twin Peaks. Nightingale doesn't like trees or coffee. Dale Cooper loves both. Nightingale wanted to turn his car around and drive until he ran out of road or booze. Cooper wants to figure out what's going on in Twin Peaks. Mirror Peak, a later location of the game, is a direct reference to the name Twin Peaks. There's some doppelganger stuff in the later parts of this story, which is heavily referenced in Season 2 of Twin Peaks and followed up on heavily in Season 3. Even the Shadow Men themselves resemble the Woodsman from Twin Peaks The Return, though that one isn't a direct reference as Season 3 of Twin Peaks hadn't been released by the time Alan Wake was given to the world. The miniseries prequel to the game, entitled Bright Falls, even has a song titled Northern Passage, which was the original title of Twin Peaks. But it's not just enough to explain these surface-level references in the game. Easter eggs are one thing, a possible homage to a previous material, but is Alan Wake Lynchian? The term Lynchian itself is incredibly overused, and most probably don't even understand what it really means. The word was actually accepted into the Oxford Dictionary in 2018, along with Tarantino-esque, Kubrickian, and Bergman-esque, which are all just hilarious to use seriously in general conversation. In an ID article titled How Lynchian Became the Most Overused Phrase on the Planet, Emma Madden recalls an overheard conversation at a bus stop where a man asked his friend if a rainbow in a puddle on the street from some traffic lights looked Lynchian. His friend replied, "Why the fuck does everything have to be Lynchian? That's just some oil on the road, Dave." But what even is Lynchian? We should probably know what it is if we're going to determine if Alan Wake is it. David Foster Wallace is the foremost descriptor of the term Lynchian, and possibly the most quoted surrounding it. It's hard to get outside of his definition, even if it is probably the best. Wallace said in a Charlie Rose interview that Lynchian was something about the unbelievably grotesque in a union with the incredibly banal. In this interview, Wallace was referencing an article that he wrote when he was allowed to visit the set of Lynch's next film, Lost Highway. In the article, David Lynch keeps his head, which is still a fantastic read to this day. Wallace says, an academic definition of Lynchian might be that the term refers to a particular kind of irony where the very macabre and the very mundane combine in such a way as to reveal the former's perpetual containment within the latter. Specifically in this article and the Charlie Rose interview, Wallace references Dahmer as being very Lynchian, specifically the fact that he stored human heads in his fridge next to normal everyday items like chocolate milk. The juxtaposition of a commonly purchased product next to something so foul and inherently violent is Lynchian. In Twin Peaks specifically, the idyllic town of Twin Peaks, set against the grisly murders and investigations, the crime and gallivanting, is Lynchian. So, with these examples and definitions in hand, is Alan Wake Lynchian? Well, no, not really. There really isn't anything macabre or grotesque in Alan Wake. Alan Wake is very much a representation of multiple different genres of the supernatural, the psychological, a pastiche of these genres. Alan Wake prominently features birds. Does that make it Hitchcockian? Alan Wake has a writer as the main character. Does that make it Kingian? Alan Wake has its main character hit a man when traveling into a spooky town when we first see him. Does this make him Toyama-esque? Alan Wake is definitely inspired by all of these things, but it isn't really doing what these previous pieces of media have done. It's taking very small elements from all of these things and making something incredibly new and interesting. Alan Wake generally focuses on telling a meta-narrative, which we'll get to in a bit, but its focus is taking multiple ingredients and stirring them into its massive cauldron to create some new sort of potion, one intoxicating and delicious. There's also the argument that Twin Peaks was half David Lynch and half Mark Frost, and honestly that's a subject for a video in and of itself. Alan heads to the back of the restaurant to find Stucky. On his way, he can play a song for the Anderson brothers on the jukebox, and the lamp lady will tell him not to go into the dimly lit hallway. Of course, we go into the dimly lit hallway, and before we can talk to Stucky, we talk to a woman in a black veil, who gives us the keys to the cabin and says that she'll be by later to ensure that we've settled in. After we head out and reunite with Alice, we see Stucky leaving the diner with the key to the cabin that we rented. This leaves us with a big, massive question. Who was that woman, and where are our hero and his wife headed? Alan does some more narration, elaborating on his writer's block. He hasn't been able to write a word in 2 years. The two arrive at Cauldron Lake, which holds a small island called Diver's Isle, a beautiful place set in the middle of the water, surrounded by mountains and beautiful vistas. The power is off inside, and we're forced to turn on a generator to get the power running. Alan's goal with this trip is to relax and forget about work, but that's not necessarily what's going to happen. Back inside, Alice has a surprise, a typewriter and some fresh paper. She tells Alan about a local Dr. Hartman who specializes in helping artists. Alan lashes out about this, infuriated. He tries to leave the island but trips outside. When he hears Alice scream, he heads back inside to find the railing broken, and he dives in the water. Just as quickly as this happens, Alan wakes up in his car, wrecked, hanging halfway off of a mountain. Alan's phone is dead. He's stranded in the middle of the woods in a place that he doesn't know on a dark and foggy night. He decides to head for the nearest light source, a gas station close by. Heading through these woods, Alan comes upon some pages from a manuscript that he had written. It was called Departure. This is the name that Alan had planned to use for his next book, but the scary part is he had never gotten around to writing Departure. So who has written this? This is a large part of Alan Wake, its story, its collectible system, its hidden narrative, the manuscript pages. These are small, glowing pages that we find in various places throughout the game. They usually are a short piece of writing describing some brief scene. The scenes described aren't just from some narrative that Alan planned to write, they are coming true in real life. These events can be ones that already happened, ones that are happening, or ones that haven't yet happened. Alan stays clueless for most of the game about what's really going on, that he wrote these pages, and that he has brought these horrors to life in the real world. That's not really the big twist, though. There isn't really a huge, massive twist in Alan Wake, to be honest. It's pretty open about what it is. It isn't trying to trick you. But the story is at once about a writer trying to survive his own story that he's already written, trying to figure out how to get out of this story that he's already written, but the story is also about that same writer writing himself into that story. Obviously, the who's and the what's and the where's are something we will get to in time, but this is the focal point. It is of grave importance that we understand this early so we can provide examples of this moving forward. In my opinion, Alan Wake is really about how we interact and interface with media, whether that be books, films, TV shows, albums, or video games. It's worth noting here as well that every medium is equally represented in Alan Wake. A myriad of references to an influential television show and different iconic films, novels take up large real estate in the game's plot, and music plays an incredibly important role in the story, which we'll get to. But I believe it speaks to, more than anything, the audience of the media that it currently is, a video game. Brendan Keogh, in his expert examination of the way that we interact with video games, A Play of Bodies, How We Perceive Video Games, says this: if a video game is to be textually experienced, that experience is perceived through the bodies that come together to mediate and determine some things about the other. This is possible only if both the human player and the video game work are from the very start understood as interconnected, neither coming before the other, but each constituting the other in ongoing processes. To play a video game is both to perform and to consume, both to act and to spectate, both to experience and to interpret. This is true of all video games, and I'm not here to restate this thesis for you. If you'd like a longer explanation of this, read the book, but I think Alan Wake is about this very topic. Wake is a writer who writes a manuscript full of things that haven't happened, yet they involve him. Then he lives out these events. Wake is both the player and the game himself. Wake is playing the video game, perceiving the story, while he himself also experiences the events. This game, more than most I've ever seen, through its story, articulates this very point to a T. I take this game as a metaphor for writer's block, sure, but more than anything else, I think it truly explores the relationship between the player and the video game itself, while also making sense as a cohesive narrative. We'll see more of this as we continue throughout the story and things become clearer. Wake stumbles upon a logging camp and finds Stucky, overcome with some sort of shadow, some dark haze, wielding an axe and speaking strange. Wake takes refuge inside of a nearby trailer, but Stucky attacks. He drives a bulldozer into the small building and Wake jumps out just in time. We're then confronted by two loggers, having our first taste of combat outside of a dream. Before we get any deeper into the narrative, I should talk about the way we fight these enemies in Alan Wake. The enemies in Alan Wake are called the Taken. There are two other types of enemies, the poltergeists, a possessed, previously inanimate object, and the birds. Outside of these three enemy types, there isn't anything else to fight in the game. There is some variety in the way that enemies are presented, slightly different enemy types, larger or smaller Taken enemies with more or less health, but for the most part, that's it. But don't get me wrong, I don't even say that as some sort of veiled criticism. I think keeping it simple actually works in this scenario. The enemies themselves represent darkness as a theme. What they reflect is actually more sinister. Insecurities, warped versions of daily routine, and inner desire unleashed. If the Taken are darkness, then what do we fight them with? The only thing we can. Light. Our main weapon in the game is a flashlight, but we also have real weapons like shotguns, hunting rifles, and revolvers. But like I said before, we have to first get rid of the Taken's shield before we can attack them. We don't only do this with the flashlight though. Environmental lights can be used, flares, flashbangs, any sort of light source that we can find. The concept for combat in general is genius. It's very simple, very stripped back. Also arming us with something that isn't traditionally a weapon, but is traditionally used in horror games is incredibly clever. If this was a traditional horror game, or any game taking place mostly in the dark, then we'd have a flashlight anyways. We might just not be able to control it as well, and it might just not be as useful. So make it useful. So most combat follows this loop. Enemies attack, we take down their shields with a light source, and we fire away. It's very simple, very stripped back, but there's also some depth here as well. We have to deal with resource management first and foremost. Ammo isn't endless. Sure, we're not always running out of bullets, but it's not exactly in surplus either. This doesn't only apply to bullets, it applies to batteries as well. Batteries are used to recharge the flashlight in a pinch. The flashlight will recharge itself if we don't focus it with the left trigger, but this can take some time. And in the middle of a battle, this can be tense. We don't have to focus the flashlight to burn down the enemy's shield though. We can just shine it on them, not using any of our battery gauge, which is much more efficient. Also, aiming down our flashlight for just a second stuns the enemy, so quickly aiming the flashlight and conserving as much battery power as possible is ideal, although it isn't required all of the time. The system is simple at first, but mastering it is a little more difficult. The whole system overall just represents Alan as a character in general. Alan was meant to be the opposite of Max Payne, like we talked about before. Max was a cop who took pills and drank to relieve his pain. Alan is a writer who is stuck on his next novel. Max was jumping through the air in slow motion, dispensing with multiple goons at once. Alan is barely getting out of the way of enemies and making it through the woods using flares. This couldn't be more of a step in the other direction if they tried, because they did try. But this is reflected in the combat system as well. It's not exactly easy to dispense with these enemies, and Alan isn't the powerhouse that Max was. He can't take many hits. He can easily get caught in the hands of the Taken and be dead within a few attacks. If we make 2 mistakes in an encounter, it can mean the end if we're unlucky. Now, I do like the combat system overall. Its simplicity is welcome. Its depth of mastery is interesting. What it represents for the story and the theme of the game is great, but it does have its flaws. I think the biggest flaw is probably its dodge. Stunning enemies with the flashlight is one of 2 ways we have of slowing attackers down when they charge. The other is to dodge. We can't always use the flashlight because frankly we just need some space. The enemies might be too close, but the dodge itself feels kind of terrible to use. It's a chunky kind of dodge, seeing Adam ducking down and moving away, but its timing seems to need absolute precision for it to work well. If we miss this dodge, we are punished heavily. Like I said before, getting hit by even a normal enemy can take half of our health bar away. This can become pretty annoying pretty quickly, and really the only resolution is just to get better. Now, of course, looking at this through the frame of the character that is Alan Wake could give this some context. Even the developer said that Alan was supposed to be an everyman, someone who wasn't an action hero, but that he develops into one over time. Maybe this development involves the player's own skill and learning the system overall. Also, I just want to say I'm not claiming that this game is incredibly difficult. I maybe died 4 or 5 times during my entire normal difficulty playthrough, but those times that I did die, it just felt like there wasn't much else I could do after my first mistake. Overall, I think the system is good, albeit a bit repetitive. It works for this game and what it's trying to do. We find a manuscript heading down the hill that details Rose's intense feelings for Alan. Another one references Barry Wheeler, Alan's manager, and his worry for Alan being far away and unresponsive. And another that details Alan actually finding the pages. Alan is finding a page written by himself that predicts and foretells the fact that he would be living this very moment. We make it through the woods and eventually come upon another logging site. This is where we face Stucky, who actually teleports around a little bit and goes invisible, making it harder to trap him with our light. We quickly dispense with him though. Right after this, we find a manuscript page that talks about Stucky being engulfed by the darkness in his garage. We get inside the gas station and find a TV that shows Alan raving like a madman in the room with the typewriter. He finds a phone and calls the sheriff's station as the sheriff, Sarah Breaker, shows up. She's suspicious of Alan, especially when he says that he and Alice were staying on an island in Cauldron Lake, considering the fact that there is no island on Cauldron Lake. She takes Alan there and he realizes she's not lying. There is no cabin on the lake. Alan Wake is structured like a television show, with each chunk of the game being broken up into an episode. This doesn't do much in practice other than create a distinct cut where the episode ends and where it begins. The game also makes sure to show us a previously on segment before starting each episode to catch the viewer up on what happened, just in case they missed something. The structure fits, but one of the best things that Alan Wake does is have a credits song for each episode. Each of these songs are incredibly important, and I'd like to talk about them as we go through the story. They reflect exactly what is going on at the moment in the story, sometimes in lyrics and sometimes in tone. It honestly reminds me of something like the Canadian film Mommy. This was noted at the time for having a soundtrack of licensed music that not only fit the period and tone, but also just felt like it was somehow describing exactly what was going on in the story. It was a fantastic use of music, and I think Alan Wake does this with its end credits songs. Unfortunately, I can't use copyrighted music on YouTube, or you'd be hearing the songs right now. If you'd really like to see the version of the video where these songs are played, then you can go to the Patreon. If it doesn't matter that much to you, then watch on. The song that's used at the end of episode 1 is In Dreams by Roy Orbison. Orbison saw the peak of his career in the 60s and had a comeback in the 80s. This song came out in 1963 and was actually a rarity for Orbison's career at the time. He co-wrote a lot of his tracks with Joe Melson and Bill Dees. In Dreams was written solely by Orbison. It was one of his most popular songs and follows the trend of Orbison's emotional ballads. The concept of this track surrounds Orbison singing to his love, who he's lost. She's gone, he can no longer see her for whatever reason, and he can only see her in dreams, hence the title of the song. The peak of the song hits during the second half when Roy starts belting. He has that beautiful lilting voice that was common during his era. The song itself clearly specifically references Alan's situation. Alice is lost, she's gone. He has no idea how to find her. Not only that, but it's almost as if his entire trip in Bright Falls is gone as well. He has no idea what's happening. He's finding pages of writing that is seemingly his, but he doesn't remember it. But that doesn't matter as much as Alice, because his love is gone and he'll only see her in dreams. As we begin episode 2, we jump back 2 years to Alan and Alice's apartment in New York City. Alan had just finished writing his final book in his famous series about Detective Alex Casey. The last book was called Sudden Stop, the final in a series of crime novels that made Alan a household name. We can see 2 manuscript pages here, pages from Alex Casey books, and it's not Alan narrating them. It's Alex Casey. But Alex Casey is voiced by none other than James McCaffrey, Max Payne himself.
Thinking in metaphors again. The femme fatale was gone. Only a sour taste remained of the kiss that killed me.
That's right. Alan is essentially the writer of Max Payne, at least in this universe. Max Payne is actually a crime novel series and not a video game. This is evidenced by the 2 pages that we find in Alan's apartment. The first describes events from the first Max Payne game, and the second from, well, the second Max Payne game. Even going so far as to address the Poets of the Fall song, Late Goodbye, in the document. Refer to my 2.5-hour Max Payne video for the importance of this. Alice has finished the cover photos for Alan's new book, and the power in the apartment goes out. This is where we learn something incredibly important about Alice. She's afraid of the dark. Not just a silly, joking, I'm scared at what's at the end of the hallway afraid, but genuinely afraid. Alan tells Alice about a device that he had when he was a child called the clicker. It was a switch that would activate a magic light and scare the monsters away. Clearly, this is meant to make Alice feel better, but its importance will be realized throughout the game. Alice's fear also happens to tie into our overall theme and narrative as well. Light versus dark. Alan is back at the police station being checked over by the doctor. He wasn't being honest with him about what he'd seen because he knew he would be written off as a lunatic. We find a manuscript page that depicts Alice seeing a woman in a black dress. The sheriff, Sarah, wants to know what happened, but Alan again can't be honest. He gets his phone back and answers a call. It's Alice, but she's quickly taken off the phone because someone has her captive. The kidnapper wants Alan to head to the back of the police station where we find Alice's driver's license. A manuscript page reveals part of Alan and the kidnapper's meeting. Barry, who has just arrived in town, calls Alan. Dr. Hartman wants Alan to come stay at his retreat for struggling artists, and he reveals that he was the one who invited Alice to Bright Falls, just before Alan socks him in the face. Barry then finally steps in.
Hey, nobody move! Get your hands off of my client!
Who are you?
I'm Barry Wheeler, his agent.
Barry's an interesting character. Everything in Alan Wake has been pretty serious up to this point for both the characters and the audience. Alan has lost his wife, he was trapped in a nightmare, he's been fighting monsters, ones that seemingly no one else knows about. He's alone and feeling absolutely insane in a town that he doesn't know. But here comes Barry, a shining light in the darkness, a friend. Not only is Barry the comic relief in the story, constantly quipping and tossing witty or corny lines into the conversation, he also represents something familiar for Alan. He's not only Alan's agent, but they've been friends since they were kids. They know each other very well, and having him here can only make Alan feel safer. His representation of a light for Alan may also be reflected in the fact that he wears a bright red jacket, where most everyone else is wearing dull, dark, neutral colors. Barry and Alan head to rent a cabin so that they can meet the kidnapper at midnight and get Alice back. I should note here briefly that the voice acting is of a very particular style in Alan Wake. It has a very familiar sort of deadpan, slightly off-base line delivery. It's similar to something like Silent Hill or even, dare I say, Twin Peaks. It's not as unnerving as the classic horror games, but it definitely gives us a slightly unsettling feel, especially the way that Matthew Peretta voices Alan Wake.
No! Look, Barry, I'm missing a week, and someone's got Alice.
Do you
and everything's
understand
just...
what it sounds like when you say stuff like that?
He has this very particular delivery. It evokes a writer reading their own work aloud. It's very strange, and it's not enough to just say this is bad voice acting, like it was something that they fell into. Max Payne didn't have a voice acting style like this. It wasn't unnerving in how off it was. Also, Matthew Peretta is in another Remedy game called Control as a completely different character, and actually gives an amazing performance. Alice in particular has a very strange delivery that makes you feel a bit uneasy whenever she's on screen.
I'll go fill her up while you get the key. I'll pick you up here in, say, 15 minutes.
Sure.
Alan, thank you for coming here with me.
I love you too. Go on. I'll promise to behave.
This could be some reflection of the dark presence infecting Alan's psyche and memories. It wouldn't be able to just be localized to the town because Alice wasn't always in Bright Falls. It's probably nothing super important to the story, it's just worth noting that the style is here. Barry and Alan get the keys to the cabin from Rusty and head up to their new temporary home. Barry stays at the cabin while Alan heads off to go meet with the kidnapper at Lover's Peak. Here we have to head through the woods, venturing again into the dark night. We find a few manuscript pages along the way telling us of the rift between Barry and Alice, the relationship between Rose and Rusty, and also pre-informing us that Rusty has been attacked. Now, there are a lot of moments like this in Alan Wake. Moments where we'll find a page that will tell us of something we're about to find out anyways. It often spoils big moments for us, but why does it do this? First of all, Alan Wake is not very concerned with the reveal of anything. It seems to throw away all semblance of story structure in an effort to build a world and creative new narrative. It seems to forego the classic setup of revealing events as the character experiences them and directly puts us in the shoes of Alan Wake. The game is titled Alan Wake. Wouldn't it be odd if we didn't experience the story exactly as he did? There are a few manuscript pages that we won't find during our first playthrough, but only during our second playthrough on Nightmare difficulty. Alan doesn't remember what he wrote, so neither do we. He finds out what's happening before it's happening from the experiences of himself that he doesn't remember. We are the player, but we are also Alan Wake. The game puts this at the forefront, this idea that the immersion of us in the shoes of Alan is much more important than timely reveals or holding back information. If Alan knows it, then we know it. But I also don't think the game would have been furthered by taking out some of the future-telling manuscript pages. I don't think us stumbling upon Rusty attacked in the visitor center would have been better than us reading it on a page. It adds to the atmosphere of the game. It adds to the world. When we pick up a page and hear about an event and then move forward only to see that event play out, It makes us slightly nervous and slightly more curious about what's going on. It's almost as if Alan is seeing a real-life film adaptation of his novel playing out in front of him, where he plays the main character and he's improvising all of his lines. It would be the same if we were seeing the scenes after the fact, except Alan himself is also seeing these scenes after the fact. They are not obscured from the main character of the story. This is why Alan is both the character in the game and the player playing the game. We are Alan Wake. This is also perplexing to the characters of the story. Rusty foresaw his own demise through that page. He's just as concerned with this fact as we are. When we get the power turned on, we actually have to fight Rusty because he's been taken over by the dark presence. Heading through the woods once again, making our way to Lover's Peak, we can find tons of collectibles. Alan Wake has lots of things that can be picked up and ticked off a list. Throughout the story, we can track down coffee thermoses, TVs playing different episodes of a show called Night Springs, radios putting out Pat Maine's audio show, manuscript pages, of course, and can pyramids that we can shoot. Some of these are surprisingly well hidden. I think that Remedy decided to utilize that open world that they had created to its full extent in certain places, because there are areas where we have to go the opposite direction up a massive mountain just to get a thermos and a manuscript page that are totally optional. Halfway up the mountain, I actually started to think that I was going to be greeted by an invisible wall at a certain point. We can also find chests hidden throughout the world that are less of a collectible and more entirely necessary to finding good equipment. They're designated by yellow painted arrows that can only be seen when light is shined on them. These arrows will point to a big torch sigil, usually painted right above a chest with some variety of flares, flashbangs, and flare guns. We can also collect signs throughout the course of the game. We aren't collecting them exactly as much as we are collecting the information on them. They usually have some sort of historical information about the town. This is interesting, and from my perspective, as almost a concept of Alan's story in a way, like those vague small details that will be in novels, just brief factoids that come up that don't really further the plot, but maybe build up the town's history. These all gave me that kind of vibe, something a writer would put in his story to flesh out the location he was telling it in. Eventually, during Alan's journey to Lover's Peak, he rides a hanging cart that crashes into the next platform. We're rescued by some helpful man who introduces us to flares, which can be dropped on the ground to push back advancing waves of taken or held while walking slowly to hold off the enemies. These can be incredibly useful in a pinch and can be strategically placed to prevent us from fighting whole groups of enemies if we want. The game does do a strange thing where it reveals that this man, whose name is Mott, by the way, is the kidnapper. Mott was actually on the barge with us at the beginning of the game, which, if you were paying attention, is just a massive find. A lot of this information is never explicitly stated in the story, though, which is what makes it so genius. The game begs you to find its story underneath. It wants you to search out for clues and details, not to explain its mystery necessarily, but to explain the details of the story that takes place inside of that mystery. The section with Mott is frustrating because he refuses to give us our gun back. We're only armed with flares and the flashlight the entire time, forced to break enemies' shields down while he fires away. This would be fine normally, but Mott is a terrible shot and misses half of the bullets that he fires out of the gun. Mott reveals that he knows about the manuscript, and he wants Alan to give him the whole thing so that he knows what will happen before it does. Wake attacks him, and we're flung off the platform back into the woods. Our ammo and guns are reset at certain parts of the game. This is something that I do find a bit annoying. I understand that it's probably for immersion reasons, and I will say that it does work in that context. It truly makes us feel like we're scrambling around to build back up an arsenal again, and adds some realism to the tale. But the side effect of this is that we never really feel like we're getting stronger or better, just sort of staying the same. Heading back through the forest, we have to make it quite a ways before Barry eventually calls us again. He's being attacked by some birds and we have to save him. On the way, we get a truck and are able to drive it through the streets to make our way back to the cabin. There are multiple points in the game where we'll have access to a vehicle and can use it to travel quite an open and large area. This is clearly some slight spillover from the original concept and version of Alan Wake, this massive world that we were supposed to be able to explore, but that just never came to fruition. Eventually, we make it back to Barry and are swarmed by our third enemy type, ravens. These will come down in packs and swoop at us. They can be particularly annoying because we don't really have much time to turn and shine our light at them, causing them to veer away. Not only that, but we can't really dodge them either. Sometimes we're just forced to take a bit of damage. After this, Barry has finally come around on what Alan was saying. He's a believer now. The next day, Barry is heading to try and track down information on the kidnapper, and Alan is going to write a manuscript so he can have something to get Alice back with. Only he still can't write a word. The block is still there. Just then, Rose calls Barry and tells him that she's found the manuscript pages, except someone else is there with her, and it's clear she's being controlled. This is the end of episode 2, and here we get a lesser-known song to cap off this chunk of the story, Haunted by Poe. This song was the title track from the 2000 album of the same name. Poe is actually the sister of Mark Z. Danielewski, the writer of one of the craziest books of all time, House of Leaves. The album is actually a companion piece to that book in concept and a tribute to Poe's father. On a side note, the album is actually really good. Its lyrical progression is fantastic and does some really cool things sonically across its lengthy runtime. It's also just an interesting concept in general. The song applies to Alan's situation, though, in such an oddly specific way. One lyric in particular, I need to get my bearings, I'm lost, and the shadows keep on changing, almost make you wonder if Sam Lake is some kind of wandering time traveler. Clearly, whoever was choosing these songs did a great job, and lyrics can be just vague enough to impart meaning on anything. When we start episode 3, Alan and Barry are being guided through the trailer park that Rose lives in. Randolph is the one guiding us, and a tiny little piece of information that he gives us is very important. He says that the local Indians used to think that Cauldron Lake was a doorway to the underworld. We also notice a boat laying in the middle of the trailer park.
How about that? It was there in the morning, as if it had fallen from the sky. But it would take a tornado to lift something like that. We're damn lucky it didn't crush any of the trailers.
Huh. Odd. Barry also got a ton of information from writings by Cynthia Weaver, the Lamp Lady. His information concerns two people, Barbara Jagger, a local legend, and Thomas Zane, a poet that used to live in the area. When we meet Rose, she's similarly deadpan and gives Barry and Alan coffee that knocks them out. Alan is in a dark place, confronted by the same old woman who wants him to finish what he started. He wakes up in a room in Rose's trailer. Alan is on the TV again, talking about an editor by the name of Barbara Jagger that's revised his manuscript during the writing process. We find out through a page that Randolph had called the police during the hours that Alan and Barry were out. We see as much when we get to the entrance of the park. Agent Nightingale has arrived and he begins shooting at us immediately. He's definitely no Dale Cooper. We have a super long run through the forest to get away from the police chasing us. This is definitely one of the low points of the game in my opinion, just because it goes on so long. Actually, Chapter 3 is just really long in general. This one could have used some cutting up because it really wasn't necessary. A manuscript page tells us that Barbara Jagger is home to some dark, powerful being or presence, and that it's coming after Alan. At this point, it's pretty safe to assume the old lady is Barbara Jagger, and she's the one that houses the dark presence that's been assailing us. We can also infer by this point that during the week which Alan was knocked out, he wrote the manuscript that's currently unfolding in front of us. This manuscript was also edited by Barbara Jagger during that time to make the dark presence more powerful and stronger. We eventually see a radio tower in the distance, and Alan decides to head towards it, hoping to reach Pat Maine, the radio host he met at the beginning of the game. Once he reaches Maine, the police too have reached him. Nightingale again fires his weapon without warning, and Wake gets away. We make our way through the woods, heading to a nearby train depot. Alice calls Alan and says something strange. After that, she's gone. This is where we commonly start seeing poltergeist enemies in the game. These are animated objects that were previously inanimate that begin to attack us. I have to say, other than being kind of frustrating to fight against, the concept is actually kind of terrifying. Imagine a large steel grate or massive metal pipe just flying through the air at high speed. If it hits you in the head, it's done. You're dead. The violent shaking of the objects is also not necessarily a pleasant sight. Speaking of, soon after this, we have to take on a bulldozer that has a similar goal in trying to smash us to pieces. We get to a car and Wake travels to a nearby coal mine. He's eventually contacted by the kidnapper who tells him he has to meet him at Mirror Peak with the manuscript to get Alice back. We find a manuscript detailing the relationship between Barbara Jagger and Thomas Zane. We face a possessed train and once again find Wake on the TV, this time musing about Thomas Zane and borrowing bits of his genius for his story. Wake makes his way through an old mine, we solve some elevator puzzles, and we find a page that lays out a scene where Tor and Odin are attacking a nurse. Wake finds himself at Mirror Peak, Mott waiting for him, but Alice is nowhere to be found. Mott is swallowed up by the dark presence, and Wake is pulled into the body of water. I have to point out the beautiful direction of this scene as Alan tumbles to the water, flare in his hand, a trail of smoke billowing up from above. It's just absolutely gorgeous. This is where episode 3 ends, and with this, we get Up Jumped the Devil by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I also just have to point out here that aside from the music choices delivering theme and tone to the context of the situation, they're also just based picks. Good songs all around. At this point in the story, Alan is definitely at a low. It's the definition of the hero's adventure. Make an attempt, get thwarted and fall down, rise back up, thwarted again. But here, Alan has no idea where Alice is and is starting to realize the gravity of the powers that are against him. Up Jump the Devil is a song that should be defined as the definition of feeling sorry for yourself. Oh poor heart, I was doomed from the start, doomed to play the villain's part. Alan is clearly feeling very sorry for himself at this moment. He feels like he's failed in every capacity. Even the trip that they went on in the first place was a trip to get away from his work, his troubles, his fears. And now the couple are in this mess and he can't get them out of it. Alan wakes up at the beginning of episode 4 in Hartman's clinic. Hartman tells him that he has schizophrenia and has been at his clinic for a while, suffering a breakdown after Alice's death. Alan can't tell if this is real life or an apparition, but he doesn't believe it. Hartman takes him on a tour throughout the facilities, a resort specifically made for artists with mental health issues, so they have somewhere to stay and get better. Hartman tries to convince Alan that Alice drowned, and Alan has been making everything up. Alan doesn't want to believe, but the drugs that Hartman has given him are making it hard to fight off these new ideas. We get to talk to the Andersons again here, and they give us a manuscript page they found. This one was important. It was about Thomas Zane, using his poems to shape reality. His assistant was revealed to be Emil Hartman himself. The Andersons also tell Alan to go to their farm. He might find some use in a song that they used to perform. When we head back to the room, Alan tries to write, but he can't. It gets dark and there's a ruckus. A manuscript page tells us that Barry came here looking for Alan. Downstairs, we find the source of the noise, another white page prophecy come true. The Andersons had hit one of the nurses with a hammer and were making their escape. This provides a perfect opportunity to make our escape as well. On our way out, we can do a little optional investigating and find out that Mott was actually working for Hartman the entire time. Alan finds Barry here in one of the back rooms as the two try and make their escape. Hartman reveals himself. He tries to get Alan to join him, to use the power of Cauldron Lake to create something beautiful. The dark presence begins to attack at this moment, and it's our time to dash out of the building. We make our way through the hedge maze and surrounding areas of the retreat. Once we escape with Barry, the two head to the Andersons' farm, but are separated on the way when they get into an accident. Through the forests, a manuscript page tells us that the dark presence is chained to the outline of the story. It cannot move outside of it. We also find out that the Anderson brothers were free from the clinic and that they had somehow fought the Taken before, or at least something similar. When we finally make it to the Andersons' farm, we meet Barry on their outdoor stage. The Andersons were both in a very popular rock band called Old Gods of Asgard. They had a stage on their property to perform outlandish shows. The stage is outfitted with tons of pyrotechnics that can be activated, and it makes the perfect place to make a last stand against the attacking, shadowy forces. Here we have to stand our ground while waves come at us. We're given ample ammo, and the whole section turns into a wild shooting gallery. It's a moment of reprieve in the game where we are actually allowed to feel incredibly powerful, almost untouchable for once. The Andersons' band is playing in the background the entire time, which also adds some fun to the scenario as well. Just an all-around badass moment in the game. After this, Barry and Alan make their way through the farm. We have to use a Viking boat as a battering ram and eventually defeat a possessed harvester. In the house, Barry and Alan find the song they were looking for, The Poet and the Muse by the Andersons' band. The lyrics, Lady of the Light, tell them they need to find Cynthia Weaver, the lamp lady. The two decide to stay on the farm for the night though, and they get tanked. Alan has a dream, one where he's an out-of-body observer to the night that Alice went missing. This is the largest piece of evidence pointing to what I was saying before, that Alan Wake is a commentary on how the player and the artist, to a certain extent, interact with media. Here, we are playing Alan, watching Alan discover Alice go missing. But this is all happening inside of a story that Alan wrote right after this, who is now watching it all unfold. Sure, it's all very meta and can be a little hard to wrap your head around if you haven't leafed through all of the material and taken some extra time to really figure things out. But the point is that the game forces us to take multiple perspectives on the same story. We experience the story through just about every medium possible. The video game that we are playing, the television show that is Alan Wake, the music that represents Alan Wake not only in its story but at the end of each episode, and the novel departure that we are constantly searching for around every corner of the game's environments. Alan Wake transcends video game status. It is somewhere just slightly above that. It looks down upon itself as Alan looks down upon himself diving into Cauldron Lake. There's also another moment here, one that I'm not sure was purposeful, but as I watched Alan crawl out of the water, I heard the voice of Barbara Jagger, the dark presence herself, but it was coming from within me.
I'd been easy prey.
Look at the cabin. Window.
Alice?
Maybe she did drown.
When I moved the camera, I realized I was standing right where she was. Probably just an accidental moment, but my mind began to race with different theories on whether the player themselves could be considered the dark presence. The pressure from audiences for Alan to deliver another title was influencing his story and forcing him to write more and more. It just goes to show how many layers this game does have. When small moments make your mind reel with implications, you know the story has some depth. We see Barbara Jagger influencing Alan after he dove into the lake. She told him that Alice was dead and that he had the power to bring her back. He just needed to write, with Jagger's instruction, of course. So that's what Alan did. He wrote Departure, a story that would come true, with the power of the lake itself. Only it would make the dark presence more powerful as it influenced Alan during the creation of the story. But Alan had written his own escape into the story, luckily, so that he could get out before the dark presence was made too powerful. Alan had created Thomas Zane, a poet that would set himself free. Zane was how Alan got out of the cabin, how he was freed and able to even get into the car crash that started off our adventures. This is the end of episode 4, and with that we get another song. This one is the song we heard in the game already, The Poet and the Muse by Old Gods of Asgard. The band that wrote and performed this song, the IRL Old Gods of Asgard, are Poets of the Fall. Mark Seresto, the lead singer of Poets of the Fall, and Sam Lake have been friends for a very long time. They began working together on Max Payne 2 with the wonderful, amazing song Late Goodbye that was written for that game. They continue to work together to this day, and Poets of the Fall have woven themselves inextricably into the Remedy universe by becoming an in-world band. This song specifically was written for the game and details Thomas Zane, Tom the Poet, and his muse, Barbara Jagger. It could also be looked at as being about Alan and Alice, as the two are sort of the second generation of Tom and Barbara. And now, to see your love set free, you will need the witch's cabin key. Find the Lady of the Light, still raving in the night. That's how you reshape destiny. This one's relation to the game and its story is a little more obvious, mostly because it was made specifically for the game. Alan and Barry have been taken into the station during their drunken stupor. They were arrested. They're confronted by Nightingale and Breaker, but Alan begins to have visions. The power goes out, and Nightingale freaks out. He grabs the manuscript page that foretells his death, and he's already seen it. He's grabbed by something, and the three begin their escape. Barry stays behind at the station while Breaker and Alan make their way across the town. Sarah trusts Alan, who tells her of his quest to now find Cynthia Weaver. They need to make their way to the helicopter, which the three of them eventually do. On the way, the group is separated again from Barry, who finds his way back to them, this time suited up with Christmas lights and flare guns like a light-based action hero. The manuscript pages along the way tell us about the Dark Presence's frustration in trying to find Wake, and its goal to have him finish the story that he started. After getting to the helicopter, Sarah goes to touch down, but the plane is attacked by birds. We eventually make our way to the power plant where Cynthia Weaver is. She, just like the log lady from Twin Peaks, yells at our protagonist for taking too long to meet with her. She guards a place called the Well-Lit Room, which we now need to get to. Cynthia tells us quite a bit about Thomas Zane and how he woke up the Dark Presence in the first place. Thomas wrote himself out of the world, except for one remaining piece of his existence, an object in a shoebox in the well-lit room. It should be noted here as well that Thomas Zane is voiced by James McCaffrey, who voiced Max Payne. Of course, Alan and Cynthia are separated. Barry and Sarah crash the helicopter, and all of them are chased by the Dark Presence. The group eventually makes it to the well-lit room, which looks like the best possible place to be during a taken attack. We find the last remaining piece of Thomas Zane's writing in his shoebox, a story from Alan's childhood, the same story that Alan told to Alice. His mother gave him an old light switch called the clicker that would drive away the darkness. The clicker is in the shoebox, the device that will let Alan save Alice. This is the end of episode 5, and the song that we get for this chunk of the story is War by Poets of the Fall. The real Poets of the Fall, not the Poets of the Fall being Old Gods of Asgard. This song actually wasn't written for the game. It was written for the band's 2010 album Twilight Theater. Lake had heard the unfinished album and chose War to be in Alan Wake. The song is a bit more triumphant than previous songs. It's still pretty emotional though, a love song about a companion who's always been there. This seems to clearly describe Alan's renewed confidence after finding the clicker, ready to go fight and finally get Alice back. It's also worth noting that one of the verses says, "Turn the page, I need something new." Also, the song in general is just another banger. Poets of the Fall doesn't miss. It should also be pointed out that the music video for War stars Ilka Vili, the man that plays Alan Wake. The final chapter of the base game begins with another flashback from 2 years ago, except this one isn't as idyllic of a life as the one we saw previously. Alan is waking up with a massive hangover, taking some painkillers a la Max Payne. He grabs his sunglasses, and Barry left a message trying to convince Alan to leave Alice. We can turn on the TV to watch Alan on the Harry Garrett Show, a fake talk show where he talks about his new book. Sam Lake also makes an appearance on the show where he's asked to do The Face, and Poets of the Fall are the special guest. I want to point out here the offness of all of the television shows in the world of Alan Wake. Alan Wake himself is not voiced by the same person that provides his likeness. Wake's likeness is that of Ilka Vili, and he's voiced by Matthew Peretta. Right from the beginning, that already gives the game a weird sort of unsettling vibe whenever Wake is on screen and speaking.
What the hell were you thinking, man?
Good riddance. No, seriously though. 7 years and 6 books is a long time. He was a gloomy guy to spend all your working hours with, and it was a good run.
But whenever there's a television in the game, it's usually live action footage that's portrayed upon the screen within a screen. These live action characters are also overdubbed by themselves, their voices playing over the already recorded real footage. It provides a very unsettling, uncanny valley kind of vibe to everything. The TV collectibles that we can find throughout the game usually show a television show called Night Springs, a play on The Twilight Zone, with even a voice actor doing a very convincing Rod Serling impression.
Newton, Einstein, Sagan, princes among men. But the price for such a legacy is steep indeed.
These short episodes are actually really funny, like the one about a scientist who developed a machine that would always take him to the alternate universe where he didn't die, making him effectively immortal. But then the machine is unplugged and he accidentally takes his own life. These shows use this dubbing effect though, and honestly, a lot of the time it sounds like Matthew Peretta doing the voices.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, I am Dr. Barclay Colvin, and I'm glad so many of you could join me here at the Moorcock Institute.
I'm not sure if this is because this is Alan's story that he's created, so he's doing the voices as well, or maybe it's just a similar sounding actor. Regardless, this uncanny dubbing is very off-putting and creates an interesting atmosphere and distinct style to the game that I just love. Eventually, in the flashback, Alice comes home and Alan is very confrontational, fleshing out some more of the issues that he's gone through in the past. The two plan to go on a vacation soon after this. We jump back to present day, and Alan needs to head back to the cabin so he can finish writing the story. Once he does, he'll be able to fix all of this. He needs to do it alone though, and he leaves the group behind. Now that Alan has the clicker, the dark presence is trying to destroy him, not capture him. I briefly want to talk about the genius of the flashlight as a weapon here for a moment. I do think that the flashlight is a weapon, even though it's just a flashlight. We use it to fight the Taken, even though it doesn't harm them. The thing itself is presented to us as if it's a sword, one that a knight in shining armor would have. It's Alan's Excalibur. It's incredibly important, and he would be nothing without it. I would argue that it's more important than the guns in the game, because it works within the game's theme itself. The game even encourages you to use the flashlight more than the guns. There's an achievement for completing this last level without using guns at all, and I have to say, it isn't really that difficult to do. You can still use flares and flashbangs, of course, but challenging yourself to only use light to finish off this story really is sort of an amazing climax to the tale. Alan makes his way through the woods and faces down the dark presence itself. Once it's gone, he jumps into the Cauldron Lake, clicker in hand, but wakes up in bed with Alice. She's clearly not Alice, though. It's Barbara, or the thing wearing Barbara's face, trying to deceive us. In this final section, we can use the light to illuminate words, literally bringing the manuscript to life in front of us. This is such a genius mechanic, one that we'll talk about more in the DLC section, since it has more bearing there. Alan reveals the path forward and is eventually confronted with the dark presence. It tells him that there's no use, it will only find someone else, but he uses the clicker on it and it is destroyed, bathed in light. He goes upstairs to finish the story, to write the ending to Departure. Alan realizes that light and darkness are a balance. Thomas Zane failed to write himself out of the story because he didn't realize this balance. We see Alan once again finding Alice gone. When he dives in, though, she exits days later, and he doesn't, trapped in the dark place beneath Cauldron Lake. Alan sacrificed himself to save the one he loved. We see the residents of Bright Falls celebrating Deerfest, no longer plagued by Alan's story, but one person looks quite suspicious, Rose holding a lamp, with Nightingale looking over her shoulder. We jump back to Alan finishing the story, and the game ends on a poignant note.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.
Alan has realized both literally and figuratively that Cauldron Lake is deeper than he thought. He realizes it isn't just a body of water, but a powerful place that he won't be able to escape from easily. This was foreshadowed all the way back in episode 1 by the Light, Thomas Zane himself. Remember this quote?
For he did not know that beyond the lake he called home lies a deeper, darker ocean green, where waves are both wilder and more serene. To its ports I've been. To its ports I've been.
Alan Wake is incredible on its own. Its 6 episodes comprise a story that is at once unique, interesting, multi-layered, and fantastic. The final song we get for the base game is, fittingly, Space Oddity by David Bowie. This is one of Bowie's most popular songs, really his first big hit. This would be the song that would skyrocket him into superstardom. The song itself tells the story of a character named Major Tom, who has just embarked on a space mission. He's become incredibly popular on Earth, but then the mission goes wrong. It's a pretty simple song released in 1969, but is still one of Bowie's best. Many interpretations of the song's meanings have been furthered throughout the years, that the song was just a literal story about a spaceman. Bowie himself said it was about the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Some think it was a criticism of commercialism in the media, and even thought to represent counterculture in the 60s. I always interpreted it as reflecting the struggles of major fame and the isolation it brings. Regardless, at this point in the story, Alan is Major Tom. He's been lost in space. He's alone, floating away from home, as the Earth gets smaller and smaller. He's achieved his goal, but at what cost? But Alan Wake's story did not end there, and before we can wrap up talk on this game, we have to talk about a few other things first. Alan Wake was originally developed to be a complete story on its own, and the base game really is. It may not feel like it, but Alan set out to complete the goal that he wanted to save Alice. The first game was meant to be Season 1, and the team had planned some story DLC to bridge the game between Season 1 and 2, which would presumably be the sequel. The first of these DLC was called The Signal. This was a special feature rather than an episode on its own. This first special begins with Alan arriving at the diner in Bright Falls. Here, the same events from the beginning of the base game play out, but everything is slightly off, with an odd yellow filter over the scene and voices sounding a bit demonic.
Use a tune right now. Number 6 in the...
Alan knows that he must go to the back of the diner, though, and arrives in the bathroom to find Zane talking to him through a mirror. Zane provides him with weapons and tells him to not fall deeper into this illusion. He has to focus. The illusion itself is the dark place, the place that Alice was trapped in, the place he now has to get out of. When Alan finds a part of his manuscript later, words begin to appear in front of him. Focusing on the words or shining a light on them makes items appear or events take place. This is something that the DLC introduces as a new mechanic, and it works perfectly. This is proof enough that Alan Wake's DLC is not predatory. It is entirely story content that serves to bridge the gap between the story and a potential sequel. Also, giving players an entirely new mechanic and theme is not something that studios often do with DLC, especially if it's rooted in predatory money-grubbing behavior. The mechanic itself works really well and is something I would have loved to have been able to play around with a little more, even though I don't think it could have stood the test of an entire game. I like it, but if it was the main mechanic of Alan Wake, it would have gotten old pretty quick. Activating booms or explosions in the area to take out groups of enemies is great. Even setting off the word rock to tumble enemies away can feel satisfying. One particularly clever use of this mechanic was tossing a flare down a well to activate the word hole, which then blew a hole in a nearby pipe. I should also note that this entire DLC plays with environments a lot better than the main game. It uses a lot of the same locations as Alan Wake, but plays with this dream narrative quite a lot. Usually environments will be warped or combined together, and the whole thing actually has quite a bit of a Silent Hill 2 vibe to it, jumping down holes and warping together rooms. Alan gets his phone back and Zane tells him to follow the signal, otherwise he will slip deeper into the dark place. Eventually we meet up with a dark place version of Barry who we're joined by after activating the word friend. Eventually we end up in Alan's apartment. Zane appears and tells him that he's doing this to himself. His own mind is warping the places and creates these manifestations. At this moment, the TV screens that have been warning him thus far begin to attack him. Defeating the screens, the insane version of him starts screaming. Alan passes out and wakes up again in Hartman's clinic, repeating the loop as he did before. He's surrounded by manuscript pages and realizes the futility of what he's doing, that he really is trapped in the dark place. Don't worry, because each special also gives us an end credits song. The Signal caps off its short story with No, I Don't Remember by Anna Turnheim. Turnheim was a Swedish singer-songwriter. Her songs have been featured in a myriad of television shows and even a game we've already talked about on this channel, Silent Hill Downpour. The song that plays in Alan Wake is mostly about reflection, reflecting on the past, the good times that used to grace one's life. Alan is clearly spiraling at the idea that he may never be able to get out of the dark place. In a Twilight Zone kind of twist, Wake has saved his love, but they are forever apart. One of them is forced to be trapped to tip the scales of balance one way or the other. The second and final DLC was titled The Writer. It takes place directly after the previous DLC, as Alan is still trying to find his way out of the dark place. Alan gets through some more spooky environments and eventually talks to Zane again. He tells Alan that he has to get to Cauldron Lake. He must be reunited with himself or be lost to the dark presence forever. He gives Alan a manuscript page that allows him to create some paths forward. We have an absolutely wild platforming section here. We're using floating beds as vehicles to move forward, tumbling and turning houses. It's kind of wild what the game's environments can rise to when asked, and I kind of wish we could have gotten this interesting scenery in the main game. Zane tells Alan that the dark place is home to beings that are much stronger than we can imagine. Zane doesn't know how to get Alan out of the dark place or what happened to the dark presence. Not a good sign. We eventually learn that Alan has effectively split himself in two. The one in control of Alan's surroundings right now is in the cabin, currently in a massive fit of insanity. The Alan that we control is the rational part, and the goal is to get him back in control before the dark presence can take us over. Zane tells us further that there's another Alan, an evil Alan, called Mr. Scratch, that is not actually part of Alan, but was created by him to fit into his own story. Yeah, it's slightly confusing. We start to see twisted fantasies of Alan's imagination. He witnesses a fake conversation between Hartman and a deranged version of himself, represented as a television head.
Well, let's start with the obvious, the car crash. Untreated head trauma. All due respect to Doc Nelson, but he's hardly a neurosurgeon. I think that the injury has affected you more than you realize.
Yeah, I have had bad headaches.
He hears a conversation where Alice spews hatred for him. None of it is real, just part of Alan's psychosis spilling up into his reality. Our goal here is to get to the lighthouse. One of the coolest parts of the DLC is when the lighthouse is illuminated, spinning around in circles. Its beam will defeat enemies, but we have to get rid of the rocks blocking the way. When we do, it blasts groups of Taken in one swift arc. It's a fantastic moment, and this whole climb to the top is all the greater for it. Alan is almost at the cabin when this imaginary version of Barry begins to try and stop him. He's upset that Alan is trying to get rid of this dream world. He, of course, spews tons of negative remarks towards Alan that aren't actually true, but reflective of this deranged version of Alan's psyche, all of the insecurities that Alan projects onto his friends. We have a big final boss against the fake Barry, Anderson brothers, and Hartman. When they're destroyed, Alan is allowed to enter the cabin. Alan merges with his other self, finally regaining control, regaining sanity. He can't make a mistake like that again. If he slips out of reality, he could be gone forever. He finally has a new clarity, a new goal looking forward. Alan starts a new manuscript, a second book, titled Return by Alan Wake. This episode is capped off with one final song, The Darkest Star by Depeche Mode. At this moment, Alan is filled with determination. He has a plan moving forward. He's writing a new manuscript, ready to change things once again. But this time, he'll do it right. He'll get out of the dark place and be reunited with Alice. This song speaks directly to Alan. This is where Alan's story ends. Well, sort of. Not really, I kind of lied. There's one more piece of Alan's story that we have to talk about. In May of 2011, a rumor began circulating that a sequel to Alan Wake was being developed. This came from a LinkedIn profile for the artist Althea Suarez Gata, who had listed that they worked on Alan Wake 2. The next day, a spokesperson from Remedy came forward. Turns out that Remedy was not about to announce a sequel, but something from the world of Alan Wake was coming, neither sequel nor DLC. This turned out to be Alan Wake's American Nightmare. This game specifically exists to expand the world of Alan Wake, but not necessarily continue the story. It's possible this story could exist in some sort of alternate timeline or be an attempt by Alan to get out of the dark place. Nothing is certain, though, or confirmed. It's all up to speculation. The game also was not part of the recent remaster of Alan Wake, so it's possible this may end up being just retconned out of the story entirely, if it was ever meant to be officially a part of it. The game begins with a live-action cutscene of Alan trapped in the dark place with Mr. Scratch, his doppelganger that was talked about in the DLC. Alan is transported to a place where the submerged cabin has been lost. The story in-game is that this all takes place in an episode of Night Springs, because Alan is actually in Arizona, not Bright Falls. Here, Alan is trying to fulfill certain elements that are written on a manuscript page. These manuscript pages are from the Return manuscript that Alan was writing at the end of the DLC. Alan has to find 3 different items and put them in specific places. Buy an oil derrick, he has to place a CD in a CD player, turn on some lights, and get the derrick running. These specific conditions cause a massive satellite to collide with an asteroid in space and destroy the oil derrick. At the same time, we're also following just behind Mr. Scratch, trailing him as he pretends to be Alan. He's a sort of evil version of Alan, running around and torturing people. There's also something else pretty interesting about this reality, that Barry is the manager for Old Gods of Asgard instead of Alan. After we fulfill the reality-changing conditions, we trace Mr. Scratch to the observatory. Here we encounter a scientist who is manning the large machine. Mr. Scratch was already here and sabotaged the imaging array so that we couldn't get a very important signal coming from a satellite. We have to help her out and eventually get this signal, which is incomplete. The final location we travel to is the drive-in theater, tracking down Mr. Scratch. At the theater is a woman who is trying very hard to get in Alan's pants. She's been seduced by the darkness and is now trying to seduce everyone else. We reset the power to the place and are confronted by Mr. Scratch, who threatens us, telling us our goal and efforts are futile. When we return to the girl, she gives us the access code to the projector room. We have to take down some Taken to get inside, and we have to use the signal that we found before to match the room to the details on the page. These can be things like movie posters in a specific spot or the calendar on the wall. When we get it correct, it doesn't matter because the signal wasn't complete. We need the rest of it, so we're reset back to the beginning, back to the sunken cabin. This is our loop. We actually have to go through this loop 3 times through the course of the story. Now, of course, we don't do the exact same thing every time, and things actually get a little shorter each run through, with some of the people we encounter retaining memories of the previous loops and helping us out. I think the story and scenario for this little minigame, which is what I'm going to be referring to American Nightmare as, is really good. There's a lot of interest here, especially because the story is slowly revealed over the course of American Nightmare's brief playtime. It's not given to us all at once, and we're kind of lost for a lot of it. But as we figure out what's going on, we're kind of along for the ride. There's also been a big change in gameplay in this entry. The light and dark mechanics are still there, but this game is much more action-focused than the base Alan Wake game. We have a larger variety of weapons, different shotguns, types of pistols, and even an assault rifle. We can unlock certain weapons by collecting more manuscript pages. These weapons get more powerful and useful. We also get more enemy varieties in this entry, even some guys in vests that hurl shadow grenades at us. The combat is really fun in this entry, so fun that they've even added an arcade mode where you can challenge yourself to battle the Taken to your heart's content. Eventually, going through the loop 2 more times, Alan gets the situation in the projector room correct. Mr. Scratch is destroyed. The agent of something larger has been defeated. The champion of light has won. Alice is finally reunited with Alan. This beautiful shot of light and dark on either side is just a fantastic end to this. It's confirmed at the end, though, that Alan is still trapped in the dark place, and the narrator lets us know that this could just be a figment of Alan's imagination. The script is titled Return, and the last thing we see is Barry waking up in his motel room, calling out for Alan. This little game was actually really welcome, in my opinion. These sort of little projects are a lost art form. We don't really get these middle-sized games anymore. It's kind of a shame, but also probably better off, because most of the time they're used to just get some extra cash out of the audience. American Nightmare is a rare example of the team doing something fun and interesting with their world. There's a few more parts of Alan Wake's world that we haven't yet explored. The first is a very brief mini-series that was created as a prequel to Alan Wake called Bright Falls. The mini-series is seemingly the only piece of media to not have the weird dubbing effect going on that even American Nightmare had. My pet theory is because this is the only real piece of media and not an Alan Wake creation. The show centers around Jake Fisher, a journalist who is doing a story on Dr. Hartman. He meets Rose very early on in the diner, who, true to form, won't shut up about Alan Wake. Jake hits a deer in the middle of the night, which is quite ironic considering Deer Fest is so soon. Jake gets to the motel, and the owner is very silent, classic, creepy bad guy in a horror. The tone to this miniseries is also very different than that of the game. It's very quiet, very still and slow. It takes its time, and there's actually some genuinely spooky moments here, where Alan Wake feels a bit more kitschy. While Jake is in town, he decides to meet up with an old friend named Ellen. It doesn't go well because it seems Ellen has feelings for Jake, but he's already with someone. Jake finally heads to his interview with Hartman, but when Hartman starts to use his tricks on him, he gets some vicious visions and doesn't remember anything from their conversation. He has some crazy notes from the interview and heads through a tunnel, only to wake up in the woods, covered in blood. Nobody really listens to any of Jake's concerns, but the motel owner is eventually taken. We see a news report about Alan Wake on TV, and Jake has another vision when a Deerfest commercial plays. He wakes up inside of a body bag on the shores of a lake. Jake decides to head back to Hartman's and tries to get his help, but it doesn't work. Back at his hotel, he decides to tape himself to a fridge and leave the camera on. He falls asleep and wakes up untaped. He watches the recording only to find himself having wrecked the entire room. A cop, Deputy Mulligan, comes to the motel to investigate the disappearance of the owner. It's worth noting that Mulligan is referenced in a couple manuscript pages, but we never actually see him in the game. Just playing the game, you'd probably be pretty confused as to who he is. He believes Jake when he tells him that an animal must have snuck in his room and destroyed it. Jake decides to leave town and has Ellen drive him out. Jake blacks out again, and Ellen is gone, while he is in the driver's seat. It's implied that he killed Ellen, and we see Wake and Alice arrive in town, passing the crime scene. There are quite a few theories on this miniseries and what exactly it means for the story. Personally, I think it's pretty simple. I think that the Dark Presence was trying to take Jake over, seeing as he was a writer. It was trying to control him, and it either didn't work, or he wasn't the writer it was looking for, so it discarded him. The miniseries overall is alright. It does have its moments, some genuinely unsettling points, but I also think that there are some really boring points. It's only a half an hour long overall, but there's a lot of scenes of people driving. I know that's probably just because the budget was low, but seeing silent scenes of driving over and over gets real old. Another piece of supplementary media that was released in the Alan Wake universe is called the Alan Wake Files. At first glance, you would think that this was a third-party book that was released as maybe an early 2000s strategy guide for a video game, but you would be wrong to think that, because this book is actually written by Clay Stewart. Why does that name sound familiar? It's because Clay saved us and then died in our nightmare at the beginning of Alan Wake. Clay Stewart is a writer as well, working on a psycho-literary analysis of H.P. Lovecraft. One day, when he began to encounter Alan Wake in his dreams, he decided he needed to save the man, or at least look into him. His book, The Alan Wake Files, was not sold outside of the Alan Wake Collector's Edition, meaning you had to buy this special edition of the game, which I should point out is packaged as a book entitled Alan Wake, signed by Alan Wake, if you wanted to read it. The book has many different and interesting sections that contextualize the world of Bright Falls and Alan as a character, while also telling the story of Clay Stewart. The first section details the field notes that Agent Nightingale took when he was on his investigation. Through these notes and some of the later parts of the book, we actually learn a lot more about Nightingale. We learn that his partner was killed in the line of duty, and this sent him spiraling. This is the reason he's a drunk, gun-waving maniac that we see in the game. We also get to read the transcripts of his interviews that he did on various people, which shows us that he wasn't just that confrontational only with Alan. The third section of the book is short, but showcases some extra manuscript pages that were found around Bright Falls, ones that we didn't see in-game. These pages usually have to do with characters that we never see or had nothing to do with. The fourth section, Alan Wake's Fiction, sees Stewart venturing back into Wake's writing career. We first get to read an early piece of Wake's fiction called Errand Boy that was a short story published in a magazine. The first chapter of Return to Sender is also here. This is one of Alan's Alex Casey novels and reads like it was pulled straight out of Max Payne. The nonfiction section seeks to deepen the history of the town and some of its characters. We can read excerpts of Emil Hartman's book and a history on Bright Falls. The exhibits section has various clippings from newspapers and magazines. There's a piece on the volcanic shake that sunk Diver's Isle, Barbara Jagger's obituary, an article about Wake and his feud with the paparazzi, a police report from Bright Falls about a missing couple, a request for information about Nightingale's FBI background, and some photos of Diver's Isle. Of course, Stewart was not successful in saving Alan Wake, because Wake can only be saved by himself, and he's currently trapped in the dark place. Stewart, though, has his own tragic tale written in these pages. He spent a while researching Bright Falls and trying to find Alan. The story consumed him so much that he became obsessed. Because of this, his wife and child left him, and the book doesn't end with a happy reunion. I have to commend developers when they do things like this. This book is something incredibly interesting, something that most people that played the game would probably never see. I know that I never saw it when I played Alan Wake upon release. I had no idea it was even out there until I started researching for this video. But to the fans that did find it, it's an extra piece of information. It adds more context to the world, more meat to the story. For something like Alan Wake, where we're constantly digging for more information, that meat is always welcome. There were 2 comics released in the Alan Wake universe. The first is called Night Springs. This comic actually takes place during the game, specifically Episode 5. It follows Detective Frank Breaker, the father of Sheriff Sarah Breaker. He's no longer on the force, retired and now a simple apple farmer. Sarah has Barry call her father and give him the message, Night Springs. This mobilizes the sheriff into heading across town and wrangling people up to get them ready for something. It's kind of funny because their little group reminds me quite a lot of the Bookhouse Boys from Twin Peaks. Their little gang of mostly policemen and then a radio host is just great. Frank tries to make his way to the power plant to find and help Sarah. He fights off a ton of Taken on the way and single-handedly defends himself. Jagger tries to stop him, but he makes it, just barely, and is reunited with his daughter. The second comic is called Psycho Thriller. It follows Emil Hartman at his lodge, one day after the events of Episode 4 in the game. When Emil wakes up from being knocked out, he tries to make his way through the clinic, but hears the screams of Nurse Sinclair. She's being attacked by Mott, whose Taken form is coming back to get revenge. Hartman eventually sacrifices one of his patients to distract Mott so he can get away. He then gets 2 officers to help him take Mott down when he lures him out. Mott is destroyed and Hartman has to leave his clinic now that he's lost Wake. There's also a brief moment at the end that's kind of touching, alluding to the relationship between Thomas Zane and Hartman. The comics themselves were actually not bad in general. The art in Psycho Thriller leaves something to be desired. There's some weird things happening with perspective and shading here, but overall the stories aren't that bad. Sam Lake helped write these, so I can see how they actually became competent. And I have to say, overall, this is one of the series with the best supplementary material that I've seen in a while. If there's a series out there with extra content actually worth looking into, it's probably this one. Don't get me wrong, the miniseries has its flaws, there's some unnecessary stuff in the book, and the comics themselves aren't the greatest thing ever written. But it's nice to actually see a series that has some content that's meant for human consumption. Most of the time, tie-in novels and movies and spin-off games can just be literal hot trash. But here, it's actually not bad. Not only is the quality a bit higher, but it all actually ties into the story of the game. It's actually necessary, not just a cash grab. Alan Wake is truly something special. It would be the first in a new vein of games for Remedy. They were blending their previous goals, linear narrative, in-depth story, with this new idea, a wide and deep world that was full of interesting threads. The game's story itself has so much to say, enough to fill a book with. It's at once a commentary on writer's block, and not just writer's block, but the pain that comes from it, the defeating nature of the beast on the page, the monumental task of writing and the doubt associated with it. Because writer's block isn't just running out of ideas, it's being terrified to come up with a bad idea. The game's shadows represent this concept, spitting insults as if they come from your very own mind. But the game also comments on the player themselves, how the player deals with being connected to a video game, how when we pick up that controller or use that keyboard, we are connected with the game. We are both at once the game, the player, and something new, something both at the same time. This also comments on how the creator of the game interacts with it as well. They create the game, but a piece of them is still inside it, still interacting with it long after it's been put into someone else's hands. It's something inescapable, a constant forever. Alan Wake as a video game is also a wildly unique design. Especially for the time, it was interesting to see an action/horror game that forced you to fight darkness with light. Rather than being the action hero running and gunning through the streets of New York, we're wandering the forests, picking up pages and using a flashlight to push away monsters in the dark. But I think one of the most interesting things that Remedy does is incorporate media into their games. Not only the media that they love, but the other media they create. They somehow manage to blend every piece into one cohesive world, where it constantly feels like we need to move outside of it to piece together the story. This fulfills the goal that games like Silent Hill set out to do back in the 90s and the early 2000s. It forces you to piece the story together to figure out what's going on, while also telling you that figuring out the mystery isn't necessarily the point. Alan Wake was a massively wonderful project. It's incredibly unique, different, a shining light in the darkness. It's a game that won't soon be forgotten by me or anyone else that's had the pleasure of enjoying its world. Alan Wake got decent reviews upon release. The Xbox 360 version has an 83 on Metacritic as of today. Some critics loved the game, The Independent in particular giving it a 5 out of 5 and praising the game's pacing. Other outlets like Wired weren't as keen on it, giving it a 6 out of 10 and citing the untapped potential of the game as its main weakness. The game did go on to win its fair share of awards. It was given IGN's Best Horror Game Award of 2010, nominated for Best Xbox 360 Game of 2010 at the Spike Video Game Awards, and even won Game of the Year for Time magazine. The game wasn't a huge blockbuster on the sales charts, though. It unfortunately released the same week as Red Dead Redemption, which sold 1.5 million units during its first 2 weeks on the market, whereas Alan Wake only sold 145,000. Sales started to pick up after the first few months when the game started to get around through word of mouth. By December 2011, it seemed that Alan Wake had sold somewhere around 1.4 million units. Clearly, Remedy followed up Alan Wake with his American Nightmare, but the team originally intended on releasing a numbered sequel. This, of course, didn't end up happening right away. It seems like this was due to poor sales and a long development time for the first entry. But that definitely wouldn't be the end for Alan Wake's story. His character would make a massive appearance in another Remedy game, cameos in a different entry, and at the Game Awards in 2021, Remedy would announce Alan Wake 2 to release in 2023. This was just the beginning for Alan Wake's story and Remedy's connected universe. But we'll talk about all that another time. Bye, Dad.